Are you wondering why chess is more exciting than checkers? Well, for one thing, some of the chess pieces can move a lot farther than they can in checkers. Today, you get to be a rook. But wait a minute, I want to be a fireman. Okay, you can be a fireman later in life, but today, I just want you to be a rook. The rook can move in 4 different directions. The rook can go up. The rook can go down. The rook can go left. The rook can go right. And for any of you kids out there that like to read maps, that would be north, south, east, and west. The rook has lots of choices here. The rook can go just a little bit or all the way to the edge of the chessboard. So my rook can move up 1, that's possible, or all the way to the edge of the board, or the rook could have stopped somewhere in between. For example, the rook could have gone up 2 squares or even gone up 3 squares. It would have been your choice. Of course, you can't go off the edge of the chessboard. That would be crazy. In this position, I want you to try to count how many different squares the rook can move to. What number did you get? Well, if you got the answer 14, you are on the way to being a chess master. Let's count together. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Let's go down. 5, 6, and 7. But we're not done. We can go left, 8, 9, 10, and 11. To the right, 12, 13, 14. If you got more than 14, chances are you tried to count the square the rook starts on, and that doesn't really count. Are you ready for a challenge question? The rook is actually able to move to any square on the chessboard in 2 turns, no matter which one you pick. Go ahead, think of a square. Did you think of the square G7? Well, probably not. I was just guessing. But in any case, let's just start with G7 and see if you can make a plan to get there in 2 moves. Now you might think to start by traveling to the right, but if you go all the way to the edge of the board, you're not going to be able to get to G7 on the next turn. So let's go back and maybe find a different way to get to G7. Instead, let's go to the right, but let's stop after only 2 squares. And if we do that on our next turn, we can travel forward and land on the red square. Was there another way to get to G7? Well, there was. I'm sure you found it. The rook could go forward and stop on the square E7 and then to the right and land on G7. Notice how I'm naming squares. I'm using the letter first and the number second. This square is G7 because it sits on the G file. That's what we call up and down rows, files. And the square also sits on rank number 7. That's what we call side-to-side rows. We call them ranks. The rook had 2 different ways to get to G7. Go ahead, try any other square on the board, and then see if you can figure out a way for the rook to get there in 2 moves. We'll do one more together. How about A6? Do you see a way to get there in 2 moves? Well, we can go left all the way to the edge of the board, and then on the next turn, the rook could travel up and land on A6. Let's go back. Of course, the other way was to go forward, but stop after only 2 squares, and then go to the left, and again, we land on A6. The final thing that I want you to learn about rooks, before you become firemen that is how the rook is able to capture. It's actually very simple. The rook acts a little bit like a bowling ball and runs over the enemy piece. Let's see that in action. Here I gave black 2 rooks and white only has 1, but that's okay. We're about to do a couple of captures. These 2 black rooks are on the same file, the B file. Let's have the rook on B7 travel down the board and land on the square B4. Now these 2 rooks are aiming at each other. It's like a game of flashlight tag. But using my bowling ball idea, here comes the white rook. The white rook travels all the way over, and when the white rook runs into a black piece, he can knock it over, or in this case, take it off the board. But the rook has to stop. You don't jump over the black rook, and you certainly don't keep going. Once you capture an enemy piece in chess, you always have to stop. You can never capture 2 pieces at once. Now it's black's turn. Do you see a way that black could capture back the white rook? Well, of course. This black rook could travel up the board, run over the white rook, and then he has to leave the chessboard. You just saw your very first example of a trade. Each side got a rook. Let's review what we learned today. First of all, rooks can go up and down, left and right. They can go as far as they want to, and they're able to capture by running into the enemy piece and taking that piece off the board. We didn't learn how to become a fireman. Maybe we'll do that in our next lesson. Maybe not.